Thanks for having me here. I'm going to talk about, sort of perfect timing after Deborah's talk on the timing of vaccines. So the question we're interested in is when will an effective or effective COVID-19 vaccines be available? Obviously, this is a sort of an important question for with public health consequences. Also, with our election, pretty massive political consequences as well. But I'm going to actually more focus on the economic consequences, since uh, a lot of consumers report that they're not going to come back to the economy until there's a vaccine. So, despite all of the talks about government lockdowns, the truth is consumers themselves are also voluntarily mitigating, and the timing of the vaccine plays a pretty critical role for the economy getting back to normal. Also, corporations themselves, until there's a vaccine, have to keep spending to keep their labor force safe with social distancing measures, et cetera. And these can actually also be quite costly. So, not surprisingly, governments and NGOs have invested billions. I think this is on the order of $6 to $10 billion, supporting pharmaceutical companies, primarily for vaccines. Even though this discussion we have could also apply for therapeutics, but for whatever reason, most of the money is being spent on vaccines. So our perspective is getting accurate forecasts of the timing of these so-called silver bullets in terms of getting rid of COVID would help a lot in terms of planning for our economy. So what are the answers? So I'm going to just give you some answers that are out there. And also I think Esther is going to release a poll also for the audience members here, since we can also collect, essentially I'll conduct a poll and ask you when you think, effective vaccines, and by effective is just, when we think the economy will go back to normal. So there are some answers out there. So for instance, the McKinsey, so I'm going to vote myself for actually early 2021. Okay. Because that's what the answer we're going to have is. So the consulting, so there's some reports. So for instance, there's a pretty famous report by McKinsey that profiled a couple of the vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna one. Essentially for it to be effective, it has to be about 60 to 75% effective and being able to be widely distributed by maybe 25 million people. And they speculated then in the report that it'd be available somewhere in the middle of 2021. Okay. Now you also read, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of these numbers. So there was a recent Washington Post article entitled, "Is a corona vaccine going to change the world right away?" And you have pretty distinguished epidemiologists and doctors, including Anthony Fauci, basically poo-pooing the idea of this sort of, silver bullet notion. I think their estimates are much more deep into 2021 and perhaps even 2022 that the pandemic sort of goes away. And I think as far as quantitative numbers, which is what we want, there aren't actually that many. So for instance, there's some polls that have been conducted on the question of when will enough doses of FDA-approved COVID-19 vaccines to inoculate 25 million people be distributed in the United States? Okay, and this is the data. So the poll started in April, and then it's sort of running until October. So it's pretty interesting that, when everything started, the odds for a vaccine being between October 1st, 2020 and March 31st, 2021 was actually really, really low. Okay, but there was clearly a decent amount of good vaccine news coming into September. But then it seems like in the last month or so, there's some sort of bad news. Okay, so we're going to endeavor to give an answer that's a little more precise, or maybe using a different idea, a different strategy, which is the following. We're going to infer the timing of a vaccine or the arrival of a vaccine from a corporate earnings forecast. So corporate earnings for a number of industries like airlines and hotels have obviously been massively hit. Nobody's traveling, nobody's going on vacation, et cetera. And the prospects, and also including restaurants, et cetera, the prospects for these industries obviously depend a lot on a vaccine. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the forecast. So there's thousands of analysts who make forecasts about these companies. Their explicit goal is not to forecast a vaccine per se. It's not to sort of talk about a vaccine per se. They're simply forecasting earnings. But clearly, their earnings embed a tremendous amount of information in terms of their processing, uh, not only scientific information about when a vaccine would be available, but also consumer reactions and also firm mitigation strategies. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to basically aggregate from thousands of forecasts of how these companies will be doing in the next quarters, and to impute from that when we think kind of a vaccine will be arriving. Okay, so here's the strategy in kind of one picture. So why here in blue, basically you can think of it as the economy, you can think of it as just corporate earnings for airlines, for instance. If those things are kind of humming along, suddenly at the green dot, COVID-19 arrives. So what happens when COVID-19 arrives, as we now all have lived through, two things happen. First, there's going to be this massive drop in earnings as the economy basically shuts down. Both, I think, not only for kind of government lockdown reasons, but just simply, as I mentioned earlier, consumers just simply will stay at home. And also, so that would be kind of some drop in terms of demand for the products of these industries. And in addition, obviously the companies themselves have to mitigate and protect their labor force. So for instance, Amazon is probably one of the more successful companies, had essentially declared 2 of their quarters of profits were going to be dedicated toward mitigation. So that's sort of another reason for why earnings drop a lot. Now, if you look at this particular path we've plotted out, we've basically embedded a path where a vaccine is expected to arrive in about a year. Okay, so then what happens is, you're starting at 0. Okay, now the vaccine ends up arriving at here around 1.5. Okay, so it's a little bit later than a year. Then at that point, there's going to be this jump back in earnings as consumers return, firms can stop mitigating. So we can essentially, by looking at the forecast that's going to be given by the red line here, as these analysts make forecasts about what's going to be happening to corporate earnings out, a month, 2 months, out to a year, 2 years, out to 3 years, we can impute from that how quickly, in some sense, earnings are going to pop back up based on the slope, okay, of their earnings, of their forecast earnings. So, for instance, a very bad case scenario would be, if the slope of corporate earnings was very flat, earnings really don't grow again. Right? That would impute that people just don't think that vaccine is going to be very likely or going to come in a short amount of time. Okay, so that's basically the main idea. We're going to be able to kind of back out from these thousands of forecasts on corporate earnings that, I think for the most part, the main factor driving it is really when the economy returns to normal, which for all intents and purposes is really tied to this vaccine. And to do this inference, we will make an assumption. We're going to assume that the vaccine arrival rate follows a Poisson process. So despite the fact that, of course, there's a race and many about these vaccines, there's still going to be some uncertainty associated with this arrival, right? As Deborah kind of pointed out, the vaccine development business is sort of a complicated business involving not simply, there's also kind of distribution aspects, et cetera. Okay, and so we're going to apply a very simple formula. So tau is really the stochastic arrival time, and we can write down then the forecast at time t of future earnings scaled by previous earnings as really 2 pieces. The first term here that I'm highlighting represents, right, conditioning out all of the possible arrival times of the vaccine and when the economy pops back to normal. And then the second piece here is just assuming that the vaccine never arrives in the interval between T and S, right? Okay. So we're going to be able to then infer just a few parameters. The key parameter obviously is lambda, which is the vaccine arrival rate. So the higher is the lambda, the more quickly the vaccine will arrive. And then basically some growth rates during the pandemic, and then also some growth rates represented by G hat that's pre-pandemic. Okay. And then the other key parameter is N, which governs essentially the reflation in earnings that representing all the customers coming back and all the costs that don't have to be paid by the firm when the vaccine arrives. Okay, so this is kind of a graphical picture of that forecast I showed you and how it varies with lambda, this arrival rate. So, if lambda is very, very low, you're going to get a very linear or sort of flatter profile of earnings forecasts as you go out further and further horizons. But if lambda is very big, you'll see that earnings forecast really can kind of pop up very quickly. So in other words, if we expect a vaccine to change the world in 6 months, you should see that at around 6 months, these forecasts should really pop up significantly relative to the forecast for the next month or the next quarter. Okay. Otherwise, we're going to work with industry level observations. We're going to actually predominantly focus on airlines, hotels, the industries that have been mostly impacted, and obviously clearly really need a vaccine for things to kind of go back to normal. And we're going to aggregate all the earnings up to the industry level, captured by this YJT0 minus. Otherwise, we can estimate using pretty traditional statistical methods to infer these parameters, lambda again being the main parameter of interest. Just to kind of make things a little more tractable, we will basically parameterize some of the other parameters just to increase the parsimony of our model, since our focus is mostly trying to infer the lambda parameter. All right, so let me give you the picture, and then I'll give you the answer of when the vaccine is coming, or when the vaccine is expected to arrive, given these analyst forecasts. So this is what the data looks like. So basically, this is immediately after COVID arrived. This is April and May, okay? And these represent 1 year out forecasts standing in April, and this is standing in May. And these represent 2 year out forecasts standing in April and then standing in May. So this is sort of what you're seeing is you're seeing a pretty dramatic difference. You know, in other words, and these are going to be the airline industries essentially, okay, the hotel industries. These are the ones whose earnings have been really destroyed as a result of the pandemic. So we're going to basically use this data, fit our model to infer then lambda. Right? So the idea is that exactly that here, the data is suggestive that, you know, within 2 years, you're expecting to see a pretty dramatic reflation of earnings, okay? So we're gonna try to impute from that when the vaccine's gonna arrive. So there's a couple of other data issues that we do. So there's a number of ways that we can kind of characterize different industries, which I won't talk about so much. But the industries like hotels and airlines are predominantly companies that have a lot of debt, which also makes the vaccine all the more important. And they tend to have, you know, very high face-to-face features. Okay. All right. So this is what the results look like for lambda. So there's different specifications that we run, but basically the answer, if you look at column 3, which is kind of our most fault specification, earnings are embedding that the vaccine as of May is going to come in about 0.96 years with a interval of 0.6 to 1.38. This is the arrival rate. So 1 over this is going to basically be the expected arrival time. So this is about a year, and then this is a little bit closer to a year and a half, and this is a little bit more near about 9 months. Okay, so this is standing in May, right? Now we're interested in more recent data, so we can then take our model and then basically incorporate new forecasts. Okay, so this is the answer as of June, July, and August. So actually, not much happened for June and July. The numbers weren't reaching anymore. Look, by August, the forecasts were suggesting a very optimistic vaccine scenario where people were expecting, standing in August, that the vaccine would arrive now within 6 months of August. So that's putting us, you know, closer to, you know, the end of winter, early spring, with a fairly tight standard deviation. So, you know, essentially you're talking about late winter, early spring as when, you know, the market was expecting in August then extremely good news. Vis-a-vis, or at least it was interpreting the news as being extremely good about the arrival of these vaccines. Okay, so that's the answer. So, you know, I'll conclude here. Obviously, I think accurate expectations of these vaccine arrivals are really important for governments and for markets and for economies in terms of planning and preparing. And so what we propose here is a sort of methodology to infer, you know, a little more concrete expectations from these earnings forecasts that might be potentially useful to guide, you know, a variety of public health or policy decisions as well. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, great. Harrison, thank you. So I wonder to what extent your graphs look different when you poll different groups. Your poll, I mean, what's the story if you polled politicians versus polling scientists versus polling
Interesting.
knowledgeable, right?
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm here. I'm looking at the answers for this poll. This would be the scientists, I guess, right?
I guess. Yeah.
So the answers. So I think so this is. I think we're spending roughly the same time. I think you're polling the financial markets, the earnings. They're definitely very optimistic. They're basically thinking now, right, from the numbers I produce. They may not say it, right, but basically, given all their earnings forecasts, they seem to suggest that this is late winter, early spring. And I think this is also consistent with why you see this big disconnect between the pain that people are feeling versus what the markets are doing, right? The stock markets seem to have been incredibly resilient
Right.
through this entire
It
process.
makes no sense, in fact.
Yeah, it makes no sense, but I think that it can only make sense if you're expecting a vaccine to happen kind of very quickly. Uh, Now, I guess here's the poll, I guess, from the audience here, which are mostly scientists. So middle of 2021 it seems to be 41%, although there's some 3% of the people voted for like middle of 2022. So that's total 16% voted for early 2022. So let me say that if it's early 2022, that's extremely bad news, right? Because can you imagine going through this entire thing for another year? I think if this was really true, I think the market would begin to sort of have, it would begin to feel much more queasy. I think even late 2021 is fairly bad news. So, but I think right now it seems like the scientists seem to be much more pessimistic than I guess the financial markets and the economists. I think so.
Well, they're probably more aware of the potential for problems, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. So I was just sort of listening to the talk. You can see all the problems that could happen. So.
Well, we hope that the optimistic view is correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, let me see if there's others. I don't think so. So if
Steve, there's a couple of questions from the attendees. This is Eric.
oh,
Sorry.
great. Okay, great. I don't see them, so why don't you pop them up if you've got them?
I don't have co-host abilities right now.
Somebody
Somebody
did. Here we go.
It's Rodney Rothstein. I was given the mic.
Great, go for it, Rodney.
Okay. Hey, great talk. I really enjoyed it. I want to ask you a question. When analysts do earnings estimates, how often are they wrong? In other words, what can you expect earnings estimates to tell you, and how often do you think that earnings estimates are too optimistic versus too pessimistic?
Yeah. They're wrong a lot. It's tough, I think, forecasting. But I do think that when it comes to these big events that are very widely followed, and where we're also aggregating everything up to the industry level. So now we're not really focusing on one analyst per se. We're really doing an averaging across many of these analysts. We're covering many airline stocks, covering many hotels, all individual companies, but in some sense they all have to do kind of the same task, which is to sort of aggregate science and economics, right? To produce. Now, obviously, they have a lot of incentives to try to be right. It's particularly, I think, if you happen to be right during a very important period such as COVID, your career could really take off, right? So in that sense, I usually think that probably the forecast people might be a little bit lazy, but I think probably on this time, I think there's a huge amount of effort that's being put into to these forecasts, despite obviously how difficult it is. So I think with all that said, that's how I would caveat how to think about these numbers.
So I was thinking about, analysts also we think the economy is going to be at this place next year. They give Dow forecasts and et cetera. So I just wondered, those are the numbers because that's something that's broader. Like, if you just pick a specific industry or a specific company, of course it doesn't mean much. But if you take the broad view, I'm just wondering if you can get information from that would help you understand how possibly correct they're going to be.
Yeah, so I think that's a subtle issue that I think you can debate about. So my own view is to get our interest was more about the vaccine. So then we put a lot more weight on airlines and hotel stocks. right? Because, you know, I think these guys obviously really need a vaccine for things to go back to normal. I think if you just talk to their consumers, they all say, we're not coming back unless there's a vaccine. And even their CEOs, I think, all recognize that. Now, I think if you're talking about something like Apple computers, in some sense, Apple and Amazon have done even better without a vaccine, right? Because, you know, basically the world has to shift online, and then obviously they're going to really benefit. So I don't think their stock prices, I think in some sense, they don't embed much information about the vaccine. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the
Thanks.
Dow is basically mixing up those two things. Yeah, the aggregate.
Yeah, it makes sense to study the most impacted and not dilute it with the unimpacted, I guess.
Right.
So can we now go to Neville Klein's? Are you, yes, you should unmute yourself, or maybe I can unmute you.
How's that? Is that better?
Yep, I hear you.
Okay. So I was wondering, since what you're essentially measuring is this expertise of these analysts in predicting the very question, I guess, that you asked us, did you correlate, did you do polls to see how your model correlates with if you simply ask the analyst? And if so, or if not, you know, what is the benefit of this technique rather than just simply asking them?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So remember I showed you one plot very early where I showed you some numbers for forecast scenarios, right? That's a little, that would be a little bit similar. I don't think those guys asked, I think they asked some analysts, they asked a broader cross section of people. They're what's called super forecasters. Supposedly they're just really smart guys that can kind of just, you know, process things and do stuff. So I think that type of survey probably corresponds. We didn't run the survey, right? But that type of survey probably corresponds would correspond to something like the views if you ask them. So now, why do we do it our way versus their way? So I think obviously first is we think that the forecast is their primary job. So they really have a lot of incentive to get that right. So they have a lot of money in their career to ride on that. Whereas if you're just asking a super forecaster, or the way I'm asking you, you're going to spend 2 seconds, you know, just giving me your response. Right? So we're sort of taking the view that, look, if you're going to put, you know, their primary job and their primary reputation really depends on forecasting where airline earnings will be in like a year or in 2 years, right?
Right.
And so therefore, that's a huge amount of incentive to get that right. And embedded in that is what we think of as, quote unquote, a different type of information. I mean, it could be correlated, but potentially maybe more valuable and more accurate. And so I think the numbers we showed you for August seem to suggest, if you look at these forecasts, they gave you a very tight band. You know, whereas typically in the way I've asked you your question, the bands are kind of so I think the strategy we have kind of does two things. We give you a number as opposed to these very rough bands, and we give you a standard error around that number, which is sort of framed in terms of this Poisson arrival rate. Right?
I see. So in other words, the method tightens the band around what these guys would say as their answer, even though they obviously have determined a very specific couple models to put into their earnings. And if you could get that information from them, that would be very detailed. But when you ask them a poll, it has a much wider band.